The night sky rumbled above a private airfield, rain hammering down on the roof of a massive hangar. Inside, tension filled the air. A luxury jet, worth tens of millions, sat broken, its engine coughing lifelessly. Executives paced, investors cursed into their phones, and whispers of failure echoed like thunder. Then she arrived. Elizabeth Carter, CEO of Carter Aerodynamics. A woman whose name was both feared and respected in every boardroom from New York to Dubai. Dressed in a flawless navy blue suit, diamond earrings glinting in the harsh lights, she walked like a queen entering her throne room. Every step of her heels on the hangar floor commanded silence. Her eyes scanned the chaos until they froze on one man. A mechanic. Covered in grease. His boots worn, his coveralls patched in more places than new. His name was Jack Mason, just another struggling single father, or so everyone believed. He stood calm in the storm, one hand resting on the cold steel of the turbine like he could feel its heartbeat. Elizabeth's lips curled into a smirk. Her voice, sharp and mocking, cut through the hangar. "You. Don't tell me you think you can fix this. A jet engine isn't a tractor." The room erupted in chuckles. Engineers smirked, assistants hid their laughter. To them, Jack was out of place. But Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he leaned closer to the turbine, listened for a moment, and spoke in a low, steady voice. "It's not the mechanics. It's the bypass. Your latest software update is choking the fuel override. That's why it won't start." Silence fell. Heads turned. Elizabeth's smirk faltered. That diagnosis was impossible. Only someone with classified knowledge of the engine's design could know that. And then, she saw it. As Jack rolled up his sleeve to reach deeper into the engine, ink peeked out from beneath his skin. Not random tattoos. Not decorative. But precise, mathematical lines, codes, a schematic etched permanently into his arm. Elizabeth's breath caught. She recognized it instantly. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was the blueprint of a government propulsion project so secret that only a handful of engineers in the world had ever seen it. Her voice cracked, softer now, almost shaken. "Who are you?" Jack's eyes finally met hers. Calm, tired, but unafraid. He pulled the sleeve back down. "Just a mechanic." But Elizabeth Carter, the ice queen of aviation, knew in that moment that this was no ordinary man. And soon, the world would know too. The rain had stopped by morning, and the town woke to the sound of roosters and distant engines. Jack Mason's day began not in the hangar, not with a wrench in his hand, but in a tiny wooden house on the edge of town. The house was small, one bedroom, a leaking roof, walls patched with care instead of wealth. Yet inside, it was filled with warmth. Jack was already awake before dawn, standing over a stove that hissed with the smell of fried eggs. His rough hands, scarred from years of turning bolts and lifting steel, moved carefully as he packed a small lunchbox. Peanut butter sandwiches. An apple. A cookie wrapped in foil. From the hallway came a sleepy voice. "Daddy?" He turned. There stood Ella, 7 years old, in an oversized t-shirt, her hair messy from sleep, eyes still heavy but shining with trust. She was his entire world. Jack crouched to her level, brushing her hair back gently. Morning, sunshine. Breakfast first, then school. He braided her hair, clumsy but careful, making sure not a strand fell across her face. To her, it wasn't just hair, it was a crown, because her father had placed it there. By 7:30, the two of them were riding an old bicycle down the narrow streets. Ella sat on the back seat, her laughter echoing like music, her arms stretched wide as though she could already fly. Passers-by smiled, but some shook their heads. "There goes Jack Mason," they whispered. "Smart man, wasted life. Just a mechanic now." They didn't know. they couldn't know. To them, he was nothing but grease-stained coveralls and rough hands. To Ella, he was everything. At the hangar, Jack worked with a quiet focus that set him apart. Engines spoke to him in ways people never understood. He could hear the cough of a failing piston, smell the imbalance of fuel in a carburetor, feel when a turbine was off by a fraction. His co-workers didn't understand. Some mocked him for being obsessed. Others respected him quietly but never voiced it. Jack never fought back, never sought recognition. He came to work, did his job, and left on time to pick up Ella from school. Every night, when the world turned quiet, Jack sat on the edge of Ella's bed and told her stories. Not fairy tales, but stories of the stars, of airplanes soaring through the clouds, of machines that carried men into space. "Daddy, do you think I can build planes one day?" she asked one night, her voice hopeful. He kissed her forehead. "You won't just build them, Ella. You'll build ones that change the world." She smiled, drifting to sleep. Jack sat there in silence afterward, staring at the peeling paint on the walls, the bills stacked on the table, the scars on his hands. He carried regrets, but when he looked at his daughter, they didn't matter. Machines could always be rebuilt. But a child only had one father. And Jack Mason had promised himself he would never fail her. But fate, as always, had its own plans. And it was only a matter of time before the world, and Elizabeth Carter, would discover that Jack Mason was not just a mechanic. He was a man who carried secrets that could shake nations. High above the noise of the city, in a glass tower that touched the clouds, Elizabeth Carter ruled her empire. Carter Aerodynamics. Her office was an empire in itself, walls of glass revealing the skyline, polished marble floors that reflected her silhouette, shelves stacked not with family photos but with trophies of conquest. Awards for innovation. Contracts framed in gold. Magazine covers where her face looked fierce, untouchable, above headlines like, "The Woman Who Conquered the Skies." Every morning, she arrived in a sleek black car, assistants running at her heels. She didn't walk, she commanded. Her stride was precise, her gaze sharp, her words cutting. Investors feared disappointing her. Engineers dreaded her critiques. Rivals hated her but envied her power. To the world, Elizabeth was flawless. But when the boardroom doors closed, when the lights of the city glowed through her window at midnight, her empire felt like a cage. Because in her penthouse apartment, vast, cold, silent, there was no laughter. No warmth. No footsteps running down the hall. Only the echo of her own heels, the hum of machines, and the loneliness that even billions could not erase. She had been trained since childhood to be steel. Her father, the founder of Carter Aero, had built her into his legacy. "Feelings are weakness," he told her. "Success is your only shield." So she buried her softness. She hid her tears. She built walls higher than skyscrapers and wore a crown of ice. But behind the eyes of the Ice Queen was a woman who had never once heard someone say, "You don't have to carry it all." That's why, when she first saw Jack Mason in that hangar, grease on his hands, calm in the chaos, she laughed. Because to her, he was the opposite of everything she respected. No suit. No title. No power. She smirked, her voice like a knife. "You fix a jet engine. Don't embarrass yourself." The room chuckled. Engineers sneered. But her smirk shattered the moment she saw his sleeve roll back. Ink. Lines. Codes. A tattoo no ordinary mechanic could ever have. Her chest tightened. She knew it instantly. It was a schematic from a propulsion system her father once whispered about, a system so classified she wasn't even allowed in the meetings. Her voice softened, breaking against her will. "Who are you?" Jack's gaze finally lifted, steady and unreadable. "Just a mechanic." But Elizabeth Carter knew better. She felt it in her bones. This man carried a past. A dangerous one. And for the first time in years, she wasn't the one in control. That night, back in her penthouse, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She was flawless on the outside. But her mind replayed that look in his eyes, the tattoo burned into her memory. For years, she had crushed men with money, power, and fear. But for the first time, she felt something foreign. Not weakness. Not pity. But curiosity. And curiosity is the beginning of change. The next morning, Elizabeth Carter sat in her office, staring at a file that wasn't supposed to exist. Her personal assistant, nervous and pale, had placed it on her desk. You asked me to dig into the mechanic. This is all I could find, but," his voice shook. "It doesn't make sense." Elizabeth flipped open the file. And her heart stopped. Jack Mason wasn't born a nobody. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was once Jonathan Mason, Ph.D., one of the youngest aerospace engineers in classified U.S. history. His designs for propulsion units had broken barriers thought impossible. He had worked on projects that were whispered about in military circles but never spoken of publicly. But then, 10 years ago, he vanished. No more patents. No public appearances. No research papers. Just, gone. The last trace of him was a death certificate for his wife, a car accident that had left him with a 5-year-old daughter. After that, the genius disappeared into grease and dust, becoming the small-town mechanic she had mocked. Elizabeth leaned back, her cold mask cracking for the first time. She whispered to herself. "What are you hiding, Jack Mason?" That week, she watched him closely. Whenever her company's jets needed servicing, she found an excuse to be near the hangar. She observed him with new eyes. Jack never boasted. Never rushed. He worked with a calm precision that her best engineers couldn't replicate. When he tightened a bolt, it was with care, not force. When he adjusted a turbine, it was like he was listening to a song only he could hear. And then there was his daughter. Elizabeth saw them one evening, Jack walking Ella home, holding her hand, stopping at a street vendor for ice cream. The little girl's laughter echoed, her eyes full of life. And Elizabeth felt something crack inside her. A memory. She had been Ella's age once, reaching for her father's hand. But her father had only ever held contracts, never her. Elizabeth had grown up with luxury, but not with love. And now, watching a man who had nothing give his daughter everything, Elizabeth felt a strange ache in her chest. But shadows followed Jack. One night, as Elizabeth walked to her car after a late board meeting, she heard voices near the hangar. Rough, urgent voices. "Commander Mason, you can't hide forever." Elizabeth froze. "Commander?" She peeked from the shadows. 2 men in dark coats stood before Jack. They weren't ordinary men, they moved like soldiers. Jack's jaw tightened, his eyes sharp. "I told you," he said, voice low, steady, dangerous. "That life is over. Leave." The men smirked. "You don't walk away from who you are. We'll be back." They disappeared into the night. Elizabeth stepped out, her heels echoing on the concrete. "Commander Mason," she demanded, her voice trembling. "What are you?" Jack turned slowly. His eyes, calm yet burdened, locked on hers. "I told you," he said. "Just a mechanic." But Elizabeth's instincts screamed otherwise. That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. The city lights outside her penthouse blurred through her tears. For years, she had believed money made her powerful. But now she realized, real power wasn't in wealth, or titles, or boardrooms. It was in men like Jack Mason. Men who had walked through shadows, carried scars, and still chosen to love. And deep down, Elizabeth knew, her life was about to change forever. It began with whispers. Strange cars idling too long on the corner near Jack's house. Unfamiliar faces in the hangar, pretending to be clients. Phone calls that ended the moment he answered. Jack Mason had lived with shadows before. He knew their scent, their silence. He had hoped they would never return. But shadows have patience. And this time, they weren't just after him. They wanted Elizabeth. One evening, Elizabeth was leaving the hangar late. The air was thick with the hum of crickets, the street lamps flickering weakly. Her heels clicked on the pavement as she made her way to her car. She was alone, or so she thought. A dark van screeched to a stop. Masked men spilled out, fast and efficient. They weren't amateurs. One grabbed her arm, another covered her mouth. Panic surged as she kicked and struggled. "Quiet, lady," one hissed. "Your company took something that doesn't belong to you. Tonight, you pay." But before they could drag her into the van, a voice cut through the night. "Let her go." Jack stood at the end of the street, his figure calm, almost casual. But his eyes were fire. The men laughed. "Or what? You're just a mechanic." Jack stepped forward, rolling up his sleeves. And in that moment, Elizabeth saw it again, the ink on his arms, not just one tattoo, but an entire map of codes, schematics, and coordinates. The marks of a man who had once lived in a world of war and secrets. The attackers lunged. What happened next was not the clumsy brawl of a common man. Jack moved like lightning, each strike precise, each motion deadly. Within seconds, one man was disarmed, another lay groaning on the ground. The rest fled into the night, leaving Elizabeth frozen in shock. Her breath came in gasps. You're not a mechanic." Jack stood there, chest heaving, eyes distant. He wanted to lie, to push her away. But the truth was a weight he couldn't carry anymore. "I was once Commander Jonathan Mason," he said quietly. "Special Forces. Aerospace Division. I designed engines that broke limits. I led missions no one speaks of. I've seen the inside of war, and I walked away because I lost everything, except my daughter." Elizabeth's heart pounded. The man she had mocked, dismissed, laughed at, was greater than any man she had ever met. From that night on, nothing was the same. Elizabeth's board warned her, "Distance yourself. If the media discovers his past, you'll lose everything." But Elizabeth couldn't forget the way he fought, not with rage, but with control. Not for glory, but for protection. She saw the scars on his arms, the weight in his eyes. And for the first time in her life, she admired someone not for what they owned, but for who they were. But the shadows weren't done. 2 weeks later, the same van returned, this time not for Elizabeth, but for Ella. Jack came home to find the door ajar, his daughter's toy lying abandoned on the floor. His blood ran cold. A note sat on the table, "Commander. Come alone." Elizabeth found him moments later, his hands trembling as he packed a small bag. She grabbed his arm. "Don't go. We'll call the police." "They won't stop them," Jack said, his voice like stone. "This is my war. And I won't let them touch her." Elizabeth's throat tightened. For the first time, she realized the true depth of this man. Not a mechanic. Not just a father. But a warrior who would burn the world to protect his child. And so, she made a choice. "I'm coming with you." Jack shook his head. "This isn't your fight." But Elizabeth Carter, Ice Queen of the Skies, lifted her chin. "It is now." That night, in the rain-soaked shadows of the airfield, Elizabeth saw the full truth of Jack Mason. The commander who had vanished, the father who had hidden in grease and dust, the man who carried the past on his skin. And as they prepared to face the enemies closing in, Elizabeth realized something she had never believed before. That true power wasn't in money or crowns. It was in sacrifice. It was in love. And it was in a mechanic who was more than the world would ever know. The rain poured in sheets over the abandoned airfield, soaking the cracked asphalt where Jack Mason stood. His shoulders were squared, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with the fire of a man who had already lost once and refused to lose again. Beside him stood Elizabeth Carter, no longer the cold, untouchable CEO of Carter Aero, but a woman who had finally stripped away her armor. She wore no designer heels, no sharp suits tonight. Just a raincoat, soaked through, as her trembling hand gripped Jack's arm. And in front of them, headlights cut through the storm. The van screeched to a halt. The men who emerged weren't random thugs anymore. They were soldiers. Trained. Dangerous. Men from Jack's past. One of them shoved Ella forward. The little girl's face was pale, tears streaking down her cheeks. Jack's chest clenched. His daughter, the only reason he had survived all these years, was now a pawn in the war he had tried so desperately to leave behind. Commander Mason, their leader, called out, his voice carrying through the storm. You can't run from who you are. We gave you everything. You think you can disappear into grease and shadows? No. Tonight, you come back with us, or the girl pays. Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest. She gripped Jack's arm tighter, whispering, "We'll find a way. We'll fight together." But Jack stepped forward, his voice steady and cold. You've made your choice. Now hear mine. I'm not your commander anymore. My only mission is her. He pointed at Ella, who shivered in the rain. And I will burn every bridge to keep her safe. The soldiers laughed. But they didn't see what Elizabeth saw. Jack wasn't afraid. He was ready. The fight that followed was like something out of a hidden chapter in history. Jack moved with precision, every motion the echo of years in battlefields that the world would never read about. He didn't fight for glory, or for rank. He fought for his daughter. Elizabeth, too, found herself in the chaos. She wasn't a soldier, but she was no longer just a bystander. She threw herself in, grabbing Ella, shielding her, refusing to let fear paralyze her. The Ice Queen had melted, and in her place stood a woman willing to sacrifice everything for family. Minutes felt like hours. Blows landed, shouts rang, and rain mixed with blood on the asphalt. But in the end, Jack stood tall. The soldiers, defeated and broken, limped into the darkness, their leader spitting one final threat. You can't hide forever, Mason. But Jack didn't even look at him. His eyes were only on Ella, who ran into his arms, sobbing, clinging to him as though she'd never let go. And Elizabeth watched, tears streaming down her own face. For the first time, she saw love in its purest form, not the calculated deals of boardrooms, not the power games of empires. But a man, broken and scarred, who still chose to love. In the weeks that followed, the world whispered. Rumors spread of Carter Aero's CEO standing by a mechanic who was not a mechanic. Reporters dug into Jack's past, uncovering fragments of truth. The board urged Elizabeth to step away. He's dangerous. He's baggage. You'll lose your crown. But Elizabeth Carter didn't flinch. In a press conference that stunned the world, she stood tall beside Jack and his daughter. Cameras flashed, questions flew. But her words silenced them all. I built an empire in the skies, but I was empty. This man, a man you call a mechanic, taught me what true strength is. He's not baggage. He's not a shadow. He's my family. Months later, in a quiet garden far from skyscrapers and spotlights, Elizabeth walked down an aisle not of marble, but of simple white flowers. She wore a gown, elegant yet modest. Jack stood waiting, no longer just a single dad, no longer just a shadow of a commander, but a man who had finally found peace. Ella, her face glowing with joy, ran between them, holding their hands as vows were spoken. Guests whispered in disbelief. The CEO married a mechanic? But Elizabeth smiled, her voice steady as she spoke her vows. I didn't marry a mechanic. I didn't marry a commander. I married a father, a protector, a man who carries more honor in his scars than all the gold in the world. Jack's eyes softened. And I didn't marry a CEO. I married the woman who melted her crown of ice to give us warmth, laughter, and a home. The kiss that followed wasn't just the sealing of vows. It was redemption. A union of two worlds that never should have crossed, but did, because love is stronger than pride, stronger than past, stronger than fear. As years passed, the story of Elizabeth and Jack became more than whispers. It became a legend told in quiet voices, of a CEO who mocked a mechanic, only to discover he was a warrior, of a daughter who brought them together. Of love that rebuilt what war had broken. And when Ella grew older, she was asked what it was like to be raised by a CEO and a former commander. Her answer was simple. I wasn't raised by a CEO or a commander. I was raised by love. This wasn't just the story of a CEO and a mechanic. It was the story of brokenness healed, of shadows turned to light, of love rising where no one expected it. It reminds us that behind every scar is a story worth hearing. That true power is not in wealth or titles, but in sacrifice and loyalty. So if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because here, we tell stories that prove love is the greatest force of all.